Who was responsible for fighting for me and every other woman over the age of 18 to have the right to vote in the United States? Jeanette Rankin was one of those women, and she fought long and hard for women to be created equal when it came to voting rights in America. Jeanette Rankin was born in Missoula, Montana on June 11, 1880. She was the oldest daughter of a rancher and a teacher. Rankin graduated from Montana University in 1902. She obtained a biology degree and did what her mother did and became a teacher. Rankin then tried several other careers, such as being a seamstress and a social worker. Jeanette later found that she enjoyed being involved in the women's suffrage unit. Jeanette moved to Washington State, where she set out to amend the state's constitution to give women the right to vote. The amendment passed in 1911. Rankin then returned to her home state of Montana and won women of Montana the right to vote in 1914. In 1916, Rankin decided to run for one of two seats in the House for Montana. Rankin had two advantages. She obtained an outstanding reputation as a suffragist, and her brother, who was also the manager of her campaign, Wellington, had many strong political connections. Being a woman helped her win the GOP nomination on August 29, 1916. She ran as a progressive and promised to work for a constitutional women's suffrage amendment and focus on social welfare issues. Rankin had strong opinions against the war. Being a pacifist, she let voters know she was not for any U.S. involvement in the European wars that had been starting to surface. This was the first opportunity for women in Montana to vote in a federal election, and Rankin came in second, winning her one of Montana's seats in the House. 4 days after taking office, she voted against the U.S. fighting in World War I. In 1917, Rankin created the Committee on Women's Suffrage and was made the leader. As promised, in 1918, she addressed the House floor for a constitutional amendment on women's rights to vote. The proposal passed the House, but later flourished in the Senate. But during the war, Rankin created the women's rights legislation, and with her help, the 19th Amendment was passed to the U.S. Congress, and all women in the U.S. were then granted the right to vote. In 1919, her 2-year term ended. She spent the majority of her time on her pacifism and social welfare. In 1939, Rankin returned to politics. On Election Day, Rankin was reelected to the House with 54% of the votes. When Pearl Harbor struck, even though we had just had an attack on American soil, Rankin still was not for the U.S. going to war. Rankin was on her way to Detroit when she heard the news of the attack on Pearl Harbor. She returned to Washington the next morning and voted no for the United States going to war. Despite her voting no, the war resolution was passed 388-1, Rankin being the one opposing the war, sending the U.S. into World War II. Even though Rankin caught a lot of hatred for her no vote, like having to be escorted to her office by police to escape an angry mob, she still stood up for something she believed in and never did what she didn't want to do because of her values. The rest of her term was irrelevant. She decided not to run for re-election in 1942. After leaving office, Rankin spent a lot of her time traveling. She went to India because she was interested in the teachings of Gandhi on nonviolent protests. During the Vietnam War, she led the Jeanette Rankin Brigade, an army of 5,000 in a march on Washington in January 1968. Jeanette Rankin died in May 18, 1973, and was said to be considering another term before she passed to protest the Vietnam War. Even though hardly anyone ever agreed with her on her views on war, Jeanette Rankin still stood up for what she believed in. She could have easily laid down and agreed with everyone else in the Senate the day she said no after the attack on Pearl Harbor, but she still stood next to her belief that peace was the answer. Jeanette was a very important part in women's history, and without her valiant efforts to get women equal rights, there is no telling where we as women would be today. Thank you.